Alright, Civil Defense Engineer here again for another episode of Civil Defense Engineering. Today we're going to be learning about radio direction finding. I put a poll on my community page there and y'all chose radio direction finding. Sounded like the most interesting topic. For that, I built this simple little Yagi antenna and we're going to learn how to do radio direction finding. And that will help you also learn how to avoid being detected with radio direction finding. So it's a double-edged sword and it's going to be really useful. And we're just going to use simple tools. As you can see, I used just PVC and an old tape measure and an old piece of coax I found laying around. Like literally less than 20 bucks worth of materials, probably less than 10 bucks really honestly. And then we're just going to use Baofeng radios. You can use nicer ones, but I just want to use the lowest level equipment to show how approachable this is. Now, I did find that there is one issue with Baofengs, and this is kind of the reason why the elite hams look down their nose at them, because their transmissions are kind of dirty, so to speak. Like they spill over into other frequencies, and it's not very clean transmission. But we'll be able to use them. The other thing is if you can find a radio that has a built-in signal strength meter in it, that's the ideal thing, because otherwise you're just using your subjective perception of how strong the signal is as you're scanning your azimuth. Well, we're going to get into all of that, how that works, but I just wanted to talk about everything you need. We're using simple materials, even just simple radios. I do have a nicer radio that maybe I could use for this as well, but I'm just going to use the cheap ones for you. All right, so what is radio direction finding? Well, as the name implies, you can find transmitters. You can do so by determining the azimuth angle, basically the direction, the compass direction from your position. And then if you move to a new position, or if you have a buddy that is in another position, then he can take a bearing as well. And then you have a triangulation to pinpoint exactly where this transmitter is. Now, what is this useful for? All sorts of things, from navigation to military and law enforcement to there's sporting events using fox hunting. You know, it's an amateur radio event that's very popular. So I actually originally got into ham radio in the first place because my first hobby was amateur rocketry, and the bigger the rockets got and the higher they went, the more difficult it was to find them. They would go. I had one that went over 10,000 feet. It was even smaller than this, but it had a huge motor in it. It just disappeared into the sky. And so we put transmitters in them and then used directional antennas to find out where they had landed. So that's pretty useful for finding your rocket. And the club I was in, they boasted a 100% success rate in finding the transmitters. And that wording is very specific, finding the transmitters, because they had found transmitters that had blown out of a shredded rocket just all by themselves in the ground, and didn't find the rocket. But but unfortunately, I destroyed their untarnished record with that little minimum diameter rocket, which disappeared into the stratosphere, and we never saw it again. I still feel bad about that, but oh well. That's how I got into radios. Was amateur rocketry. And here I am. Now I'm doing malicious stuff. Isn't life a mystery? Well, so that's one application. Finding rockets. You know, they can also use them to find wild animals, other things that are easily lost. You know, maybe your kids. So then you can find unlicensed stations. If you're a Karen, if you're a sad ham, so to speak, yeah, you shouldn't be transmitting without a license. But if you're one of these people that is going after somebody who's not really causing harmful interference, you're just, come on, man. Anyway, that's my bias. But then Then there might be some valid reasons to do that, though, if people are actively causing harmful interference, and then it might be a fun thing to go after them, join with law enforcement, and eliminate the radio wave pirates, eliminate the pirates sailing the radio waves. Ah, there's a joke in there somewhere. I'll think of it later. So, fox hunting sport. Okay, this is something I have done once because actually my wife got me into it. She was in middle school. She did this, and this was in an East Asian country, not America, and it's popular all over the world. So she did this in middle school, was really good at it. I wanted to get her to come tell her story in the video, but she's a little camera shy. Maybe we'll get her eventually. Let me know in the comments if you want her to come tell her story.
We found it! It took us an hour. Come on!
Orienteering is a little bit similar to the fox hunting sport, except that the focus is more on the navigation. And then, of course, tracking suspects. There's some pretty advanced SDR based radio direction finding radios that can track stolen cars and cell phones and all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, tracking enemy combatants on the battlefield, which, that's kind of the one we're going to be focusing on in this video because we're approaching this from kind of a militia angle, citizen militia, or I don't know if there's anybody who's finding use of these videos that are actually in a military or an armed conflict. I have no idea. That would be crazy if someone was taking tips from me. But here we are. So how does it work? As you can see, there are three elements. There's the reflector and the director. These are both passive elements, meaning they aren't electrically connected to anything. They're just hanging out here, and they're doing stuff. But then there's the active element. This is the driven element, and this is the dipole antenna. So one thing to know about Yagi antennas, this is a type of directional antenna called a Yagi antenna, invented by some Japanese gentleman named Uda and Yagi. So you can transmit and receive. So it will have a radiation pattern that is the primary lobe is towards the front. And it has some tiny side lobes and rear lobe, but the main lobe is towards the front. So it also works in receive mode. So it filters out signals coming from oblique angles, unless they're very strong, I suppose. And it has the most gain from the front lobe, from the front. Now, how it does this is the radio waves that are, let's say, coming in, reflects off this reflector into the driven element, into the main antenna here. And the director is called the parasitic element, so it kind of filters out anything that is not coming from the front as well. To give you an idea of kind of how this works, there's an analogy from a flashlight. So the flashlight has this lens which focuses the beam forward, and it also has a reflector cup behind the LED that does the same thing. So it's an analogy. It doesn't work completely because this has it's called parasitic element, whereas this is actually literally focusing beams. So this isn't using the same principles of optics, but it is doing the same jobs, and they're both EMF waves. So it's an okay analogy. Now you have to know exactly how to space these. It does. You don't just put them any old place on here. They have to be a precise length, and they have to be a precise spacing, and that's defined here. I made a quick little spreadsheet to help me calculate it. It's a function of the wavelength. So you put in the wavelength of the band you're going to be using it on. So this here is a 70 centimeter directional antenna, and then it'll spit out the lengths you need to cut of your tape measure or whatever you're using for this part. And it is handy to use a tape measure because you can actually tuck it in and stow it like this when you're not using it. So I recommend using a tape measure. It's a very common way of making it. Now, one downside is you need to have another antenna for 2 meters because it's much bigger for 2 meters. So that's one downside of this method. There are more expensive radio direction finding antennas that use an array of omnidirectional antennas set up. Usually there's 4 of them, and then it's hooked up to a software defined radio, and that will be able to calculate a precise direction that it's receiving the RF from. And now for a quick build montage. I've got all the parts you need right here, just some PVC fittings and a tape measure. You can use the tape measure to measure your lengths first, then cut them all out, put them together. You got your director dipole and reflector. Cut the dipole in half and sand off the paint from the back part of it so you can solder to it. Zip tie it to the fittings and then take your coax, separate the outer part from the inner part, and then solder it onto the dipole. You'll have to take a short length of wire and electrically connect the one half to the other. And then add your reflector and your director, and Bob's your uncle. Here is your Yagi antenna that you made for like $10. Okay, I'm going to set up a radio out here in the woods that will be my fox that I'm hunting, basically. And to do this, I have picked a frequency. I've set it on Vox, which means that it will transmit when it hears my voice. So let me bring my voice closer. Gotta. Hello? See that? Yep. So that's how that works. Then I have it on low power, and these are like menus 2 and 4 or something like that. So then I've just recorded something with frequent pauses and stuff in case anybody needs to break in, and I can rush out here and stop this. I'm not trying to cause harmful interference, but I know nobody's on this channel. Now I will just play this and set it down against the microphone and it will transmit. KD0. This is a beacon test. See? Now I'm just going to be pretending to be a pirate station or somebody that's just chatterboxing away on the... Okay, let's go. I pretend to be a wild conspiracy nut that's transmitting, you know, the government is trying to kill us all. They're building these FEMA camps and they're going to round us all up one day when we're at home at Thanksgiving dinner or something, and they're going to line us up. They're going to give us all a number, mark of the beast, you know, and then they'll put some of us in the deep underground military bases that are used for experimentation, and just like all those flying UFOs that abduct people, you know, it's the Nazis. The Nazis were never defeated in World War II, they just went south. And then they're been hiding in Antarctica. Don't believe all them silly lying NASA scientist people that are trying to tell you it's all just for neutrino study. Nope, I'm telling you it all. It's a big... Honestly, audibly, it's very difficult to distinguish. But with an SDR, you can actually see the signal strength on the waterfall. So let me demonstrate that real quick. An SDR is a software-defined radio, and it uses software to do all the stuff that converts the raw signal into audio sounds. And these are also pretty cheap options as well. An RTL SDR is only $40, but it does come from China. Okay, now I've got an SDR dongle plugged in, running SDR sharp, and this you can really visually see the signal strength. So here I've got the directional antenna, pointing it towards the creek. That's where the transmitter is, and pointing it away. Signal strength goes down. Pointing it back towards, signal strength increases a bit. And then pointing it away again. Oh, it cut out. But yeah, you can see how the web SDR really helps. And also with the waterfall chart, you can see if your bad guy has switched channels or anything like that, because you'll see an adjacent stream. So this really helps. All right. When you think you've got the direction locked in, take a bearing with a compass. So we're going to call that 98 degrees east. Okay. Then you go inside because you realize you forgot your protractor. And that's kind of important for this next step. So let's just pretend that we took these two bearings at these two locations, and this is a completely random military grid map here that I printed off from the internet because I'm not trying to dox myself. So we're just gonna pretend like we took these two measurements here. So we started off at 1, and let's say we took a bearing of 25 degrees north. This is going to assume a little bit of knowledge about orienteering because I don't have time to unpack all of how that works. But just as a quick refresher, you can use these little triangles to figure out exactly where you are on the map if you know your 8 or 10 digit grid square. I've got 8 written down here. That gives you 10 meter precision. So the first 2 letters give you what grid square you're in, LC and LB here. And then you've got basically a Cartesian coordinate. So this part here gives you your latitude, and this part here gives you your longitude. So 9,5 and 9,9 is where you're trying to find here. So that's this point right here, and on over here it's this point right here. And then you can use a little triangle part to find the exact point in that little square. Then when you've plotted it, and most people will tie a little string on their protractor so that they can actually measure this part. So put the origin right on top of your point and find 25 degrees. Make a little mark, then take the edge of it and draw a line. Gotta make them little noises or it doesn't work right. So now you know that your bad guy is somewhere along this line. Then you get in your car, you drive a little ways. You might actually want to drive more towards where you think he is, but you do need some lateral distance so you can pinpoint exactly along here. Put it on there, and let's see, we have 55 degrees measured. So find 55, put a little mark, get the edge of your protractor, draw a line, boom. We think he's right there. Now, he's probably in some kind of elongated zone in this area, but we're pretty sure we know roughly where he is right now, unless he's moving himself. But you'll want to keep checking that because it could be bouncing off of terrain, it could be somebody is moving, it could be any number of things. It could be you actually were taking a bearing off of the back lobe or a side lobe rather than the front lobe. So you got to keep checking every time you move. So let's talk about some countermeasures. How do you avoid being detected by an adversary? So the first thing to remember is to keep the transect principles we learned about in the first episode in mind at all times. And those are things like minimizing transmit power and use short duration on your transmission, and then change your frequencies as often as possible. That will make it very difficult for anybody who is trying to track down your location. But there's other things we can do. If you want, you can even use the directional antenna to transmit. So this will increase the gain towards where you're pointing, where your friends are, and decrease the gain from any other position that people might be listening in on from. You can also move locations as often as possible because it's much easier to triangulate a static position than when someone is moving on you.
Stand still. I need to crush you.
I've done this myself, and when you're tracking a static beacon, when you move to the second location to take your bearing, you can trust that those two lines are going to intersect where it is. But when you don't know if someone's moving around, that makes the first point invalid, and you can't draw a line between those two to pinpoint the bad guy's location. And then you can use terrain masking, and this is where the terrain around you will have a big effect on the signals. Basically, there's reflected signals off of buildings and mountains, and then there's attenuated signals where it's traveling through a bunch of stuff, such as vegetation or other buildings, weakening the signal. So it can really confuse the operator because you may have strong signals coming from that mountain where it's bouncing off, and weak signals where it's really should be coming from because it's going through a bunch of trees. So that can really work to your advantage if you keep those things in mind. So here are your action items for this video. Build either a 70 centimeter or 2 meter directional antenna. The 2 meter one will be much bigger than this, but it's still wieldy. You can still use it as a handheld. I've also seen some people mount them on their cars. And if you have a sunroof, this is especially handy because you can have it covered with maybe a piece of plywood with a hole in the middle, and then connect it to a shaft on a Lazy Susan or something with your compass right there, and you can just, from the driver's seat, take easy bearings and hunt down the bad guy on the go in your car. So, practice this with a buddy. It's a lot more fun and challenging to track down a human being than it is a static beacon. And then 3, reinforce all those transect principles we learned and practice them, practice, practice. So that's all I got for this video. This is Charlie Delta Echo out.